Why is the world more narcissistic? Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor. This is a question that often gets asked. Why is the world around us one which is seen as increasingly narcissistic? Well, in order to address this, we need to understand what is meant by narcissistic. There is a spectrum for narcissistic traits and narcissistic behavior. There are individuals who are not narcissists who exhibit narcissistic traits because everybody has them. Traits such as anger, envy, jealousy, argumentativeness, showcasing, vanity, for example. However, those traits are enshrined within empathic traits so that the narcissistic traits function in a healthy way. An example of this, for instance, is to take the narcissistic traits of pride and vanity. They are enshrined in emotional empathy with a particular individual. They're enshrined in the empathic traits of compassion, caring, decency, and honesty. So, for example, that individual goes to the gym so that they maintain a good figure, but they do so without causing a detriment to anybody else. They buy nice clothing, but they don't steal those clothes. They buy the usual potions and lotions and fragrances, but they do so using money which is available, rather than, for instance, taking money out of the household budget, which leaves other members of the household short of things. Accordingly, their desire to look good in terms of physical presentation, clothing, fragrances, using makeup, lotions, moisturizers, etc., is kept within a healthy boundary as a consequence of their empathic traits. Thus, the narcissistic traits of pride and vanity are kept under control, if you will. Narcissists have narcissistic traits, but at a level where they demonstrate narcissism, i.e., narcissistic personality disorder. The empathic traits are absent. Using the earlier example of somebody who takes pride in their appearance, the narcissist would go down to the gym to make sure that they look good, and they would do so without due consideration how that impacted upon other people. So, for instance, they might miss their child's Christmas play. They may not turn up for the sporting events that their children engage in because their attendance at the gym is more important to them. It might be the case that they overspend with regard to the household budget on clothing, or perhaps steal makeup. Again, that is done without any due regard for the impact upon other people in the pursuit of the grandiose image of being beautiful. The individual may embark upon a particular diet and insist that everybody in their household follows it, even though they don't want to. They've not been consulted on it, and it makes them miserable. Accordingly, the narcissist has those narcissistic traits, just like a non-narcissist, but there's no empathic traits to keep them in check. Both narcissists and non-narcissists behave in a narcissistic way. They engage in narcissistic behavior. But this narcissistic behavior has increased. Why? Well, let's look at the narcissist, first of all, with regard to their impact upon narcissistic behavior, namely, acting in a way without emotional empathy for other people, driven by those narcissistic traits. First of all, there are simply more narcissists than there used to be, not only because of the increase in the population, but the percentage of narcissists has increased, somewhere around 15–16% of the population. It's often given as a much lower number, but it's evident that the percentage is around there in terms of those individuals who are narcissists. Therefore, it follows, given that there are more narcissists around, then you will see more narcissistic behavior. Furthermore, the narcissists are now much more noticeable. This is because of the creation of social media. This provides a platform to narcissists to enable those narcissists to present themselves to the world, with the consequence that you see much more of that narcissistic behavior from a greater number of people than would have existed 30 years ago. Thirdly, perception. More people have actually become aware of the concept of narcissism and narcissists and narcissistic behavior, and therefore they more readily see it for what it is, whereas before they would have seen the behavior but not attributed it to being narcissistic. Accordingly, more people see the behavior of narcissists and recognize it for what it is. There's still a significant number that do not, but it is more noticeable than it once was. Accordingly, there are more narcissists, they are more noticeable, and there is a greater perception of them in terms of recognizing the behaviors, which means that the narcissistic behavior that is engaged in by pure narcissists has contributed to the world being more narcissistic. It follows, however, that the majority of, and a significant majority, of the world's population is not narcissistic, in the sense of they're not narcissists. They're normals, the largest group, empaths and narcissistic people who are not narcissists. Therefore, you would think that the world would not be as narcissistic because the number of non-narcissist people is greater. But the point is, those non-narcissists can engage in narcissistic behavior, and it is really within this group, particularly the normals, that more narcissistic behavior occurs, thus making the world more narcissistic. These people are not narcissists. It is important to make that clear. What they are people who do have emotional empathy, but it is only for a small group of individuals. And, as you will hear, the normals are subjected to certain influences and factors which mean that they have started to behave in a more narcissistic fashion. What is it then amongst the non-narcissists which has caused them to engage in more narcissistic behavior, even though they are not narcissists? First of all, the rise of the self-esteem movement. Self-esteem is increasingly seen as the key to success in life. Educators and parents tell children how special and unique they are. In this way, children are conferred self-esteem rather than having to acquire it through the application of hard work, achievements of their own, experiencing failure. An example of that, for instance, is the giving out of participation medals on school sports days. Once upon a time, first, second and third received a medal or a certificate. Now everybody who ran the race gets a medal because they're all special and unique. Which, of course, how can that be? If you're all special and unique, it follows that you can't be special and unique. And this rise of the cult of self-esteem has resulted in more narcissistic behavior coming to the forefront because of the attitudes that are being conferred to children. 2. The rise of individualism. There has been a greater focus on the self and inner feelings. You'll notice this with regard to the idea of speaking my truth, how people talk about other people's behavior triggering them and affecting their inner feelings, the necessity of safe places. This rise of individualism means that rather than think about the collective good, namely, how will my behavior impact on other people and what should I do to make a better community, it's more about I have certain needs which must be met and you ought to recognize that, and you either must do something in support of that or ensure that you don't do something against it. And we have seen that increasingly the case, that there has been a shift away from the collective and instead to the individual. And therefore the onus on the individual means that there is an increase in narcissistic behavior. Thirdly, there has been a decline in social norms. Quite simply, certain people just do not know how to behave. I'll give you an example of that. A middle-aged person is stood in a queue at a bank. They're a normal. That means that they have emotional empathy for a small group of people around them. Their children, their parents if they're still alive, their siblings, some friends, some neighbours, some colleagues. But not for the people that are stood with them in the queue. They don't know them. Therefore, their emotional empathy isn't activated in relation to them. However, they have been taught that it is important to stand in a queue and be patient, that the bank teller will get to you in due course, that it is inappropriate to demand that you be dealt with ahead of other people. This is a learned behaviour, and therefore, in the absence of emotional empathy governing the behaviour, the fact is this person has been taught a particular way of behaving, therefore they act in that way by recognising boundaries and exhibiting patience. It has been the case, not all naturally, but some younger people simply do not know how to behave. They're also a normal, so they have emotional empathy, but when they are stood in the queue, they don't have the same convention that has governed their behaviour. The social norm of exhibiting patience, waiting your turn, and not demanding to be seen first doesn't exist with this individual. And therefore, as a combination of not having emotional empathy for the other people in the queue, and quite simply, not having the social norm of queuing etiquette available to them, because they've never learned it, they demand to be dealt with first. They push in. They try and suggest that their needs are more important than other people around them. And therefore, this decline in social norms has fueled the individualism, and with it, the increase in narcissistic behaviour, exhibiting this selfishness. 4. Social media. Where the narcissist leads, the non-narcissists follow. An example of that is the selfie culture. As I have explained to you previously, once upon a time, when you went somewhere, you took your camera and you took pictures of the various sites, and you might ask somebody, would you take a picture of me and my wife please stood in front of the Eiffel Tower? What you didn't do was ask somebody to take a picture of you, or you and your wife, every single time. It was impractical to an extent. You didn't want to impinge on other people's time. However, with the rise of the camera phone, meaning that with an outstretched arm, or more recently the selfie stick, people could take pictures of themselves. Who would that benefit the most? The narcissist. The narcissist wants to demonstrate to the world, look, here I am in front of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Here I am in front of the Opera House in Sydney. Here I am in front of the Empire State Building in New York, and so on and so forth. Whereas once upon a time you would see the relevant landmark or view, now you have the gurning face or the trout pout of a narcissist, plonking themselves centre of the photo, so that they can then either show that off as a picture of itself, or more usually, spread it like mug across social media. What then happens is, because of the herd mentality of human beings, non-narcissists see this and think, oh, that looks good, I'll do the same, and thus start to copy. And therefore the self-indulgent, self-absorbed selfie culture, which was started by narcissists, bleeds into the normals, the empaths and the narcissistic individuals, and is seen as a normal behaviour. But it's narcissistic behaviour, but it's been adopted by the non-narcissists, thus increasing the number of people engaging in this narcissistic behaviour. 5. Empathy fatigue. The demands that are made on people with regard to the exhibition of their emotional empathy means that over time, that empathy starts to become eroded through fatigue. There are so many causes and so many means of getting that cause to people, again, through social media and mass information, that people simply become desensitized to the plight of the orphan in Africa who's starving. Television screens are repeatedly filled with these appeals. They come all over social media. And the extent and frequency of these images and the supporting appeals means that people's emotional empathy starts to suffer from fatigue as a consequence of the repeated and frequent exposure. 6. The everything now culture. As a consequence of certain advances, you can get food far faster than you once could by way of fast food outlets. You want to watch a television program, you can watch all 10 episodes back to back rather than waiting 10 weeks as it used to be the case. You want something from the shops, you don't have to necessarily go down there any longer, you can order it and have it the next day. Similarly, there are so many things, services, goods that you can access immediately or fairly soon, whereas once upon a time you would have to wait. Similarly, the rising availability of credit has enabled people to lay their hands on cars, expensive goods straight away, rather than saving up and waiting for them. Having everything now engenders a sense of entitlement and an expectation, which then creates its own social norm. And thus, a failure to provide something straight away results in an unpleasant reaction because that person isn't ordinarily used to having to wait and exhibit patience. Finally, social isolation. Social isolation, again, is a consequence of the increasing reliance upon technology, whereby you can receive information, watch programs, watch films, listen to audiobooks, listen to radio programs, all streamed to your relevant device. You can order food, both for your home or fast food to eat immediately, clothing, technology, lots of different things you can obtain without actually having an interaction with another human being. And this social isolation results in people acting with an immaturity because they haven't got the experience of repeated and meaningful relationships with other people, which causes them to utilize emotional empathy in those actions. Instead, everything is centered around them. The fast food is delivered to them. They don't have to wait for it. The goods and services are delivered straight to them. They are at the center of the network. Rather than recognizing that they might have to wait their turn in a queue or perhaps work with somebody else to achieve a goal, they can demand everything in the position of the provision of information, etc., through technology, and become socially isolated, not exposed to the necessity of cooperation and sharing and involving themselves with other people. Their narcissistic traits are exercised far more regularly than their empathic ones, thus they come to the fore. Accordingly, the world has become more narcissistic, partially because the presence of narcissists means that more narcissistic behaviors are seen by the increasing number of narcissists, but it is predominantly the case that the world has become more narcissistic because the non-narcissists are engaging in more narcissistic behavior. They're not becoming narcissists. They are not acting as a fully fledged narcissist, but what they are doing is acting with more narcissistic traits than they ordinarily would, for the reasons that I have explained. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.